Fighting game characters may come from all over the world, but Canada is definitely not the first country you'd think of when you think of fighting game characters. I'm not gonna say that's a shame or anything. I'm not gonna say they need to make more Canadian characters, but as a Canadian, I do find it interesting what characters from Canada are like in fighting games, what tropes are shared between them, and what cultural ideas related to the country get represented in these characters. So, I thought I'd take a look at all these Canadian fighting game characters and rank them in a tier list. Now, tier list is actually a pretty bad way of putting it, to be honest, because these characters aren't ranked by viability, like how tier lists actually are. It's simply how fun they are as characters, how much I like their designs, and how well they represent Canada. Let's get into this. Wolf Hawkfield is one of the original cast of Virtua Fighter, and he's a wrestler from Canada. He's of an unknown First Nations group, and is also from an undescribed place in the Canadian wilderness. Just heavyweight grapplers are a common trope for Canadian fighting game characters, I find, and Wolf was basically the one who started it. It makes sense. If you're from Japan, wrestling is probably the one thing you know Canada for, and there are plenty of very famous wrestlers from the country. Plus, the idea of an untamed Canadian wilderness is pretty popular and comes up a lot, I suppose. Virtua Fighter's characters are a little generic, but I can't really fault it when Wolf Hawkfield was the originator of a lot of these tropes. He's pretty fun to play as well, with a grappler style that has its own feel in the spacing-based gameplay of Virtua Fighter. Here's the thing, though. It kinda feels weird when Jeffrey is already there. I just find his playstyle a lot more fun, and he's a grappler too. He's also from Australia, which is basically Canada but in the south if you think about it. It just makes him feel less necessary, you know? Still, I like him, and I think he deserves some credit for being one of the first Canadian characters in a fighting game. Maybe even the most famous one. He doesn't really represent much specifically about Canada, but let's be real, barely any of these characters do. A tier. Two entries in, and I'm already talking about someone who does not come from a fighting game. Abigail from Street Fighter V actually debuted in the first Final Fight as a boss, but hey, look, he's also here in a fighting game. He's one of the largest characters in the series, and he's a former member of the Mad Gear gang, which terrorized Metro City in Final Fight. He's now a mechanic. And look, I like the presence of these types of characters in a fighting game. I am a Rufus Street Fighter IV defender, but I don't really see the appeal of him when Birdie is already in the game. The only reason he's Canadian in the first place is because he's based on a wrestler, and he was even Dutch in his first appearance, so he's kind of like Canadian on a technicality. Overall, Abigail doesn't do much for me. I think I'll put him in D tier. Maple Storm is this obscure character who's a wrestler and a friend of Armika. I only remember her from this really bad Street Fighter themed free comic book day comic. This is the only line I remember from her. F tier. She gets an F tier. I like Maxima. Carrying on the tradition, he's a heavyweight, a tank, a grappler, a bruiser. Also, he's a cyborg. Maxima debuted in the King of Fighters 99 as a member of the team of K-Dash. That's the new protagonist of this game. So he's essentially a supporting character in the King of Fighters Nests saga. Let me tell you this. I feel like the only reason he's from Canada is because of Wolverine. Because he's inspired by Wolverine. Look at those sideburns. His backstory also presumably involves being kidnapped and experimented on, and getting parts of his body replaced by metal, so yeah, he's definitely an homage to Wolverine. But hey, that's just a theory, a simultaneous comic, film, and game theory. His mutton chops are more Canadian than any part of Abigail, though, at least. His playstyle is also really fun to me. There's hints of wrestling in it, and he even has like lasers and shit. A lot of his heavy attacks have an auto block, which makes playing as Maxima an absolute symphony of blocks, grabs, and punishes. I think we have an S tier, to be honest. There might be ways he could be better in some fashions, but the metric I'm comparing him to is Maple Storm and Abigail, so sure, S tier. Darkstalkers is a fighting game series pitting together all sorts of monsters from all over the world, and of course, Bigfoot is here. Next they should add Mothman to Darkstalkers 4. He's also sort of a heavyweight character. He attacks with slow, winding up punches despite his small stature. He does also have big feet and hands after all. He's got some ice attacks in his repertoire as well, and while I do associate Sasquatches with like the Pacific Northwest, he's clearly meant to be from somewhere a little bit to the north considering his Winter Wonderland stages and snow theme, so I suppose there's some Yeti in there as well. It's a neat look at the figure of Bigfoot, I suppose. I guess it's sort of validating to see Japanese people associate a Sasquatch with Canada. You look at maps of supposed Bigfoot sightings, and there's some in like Florida and shit, and it's like, come on guys, what are we doing? Can we not localize legends to one general area, please? Anyways, while it is fun to see a Sasquatch alongside vampires, zombies, mummies, and werewolves, he's ultimately like, just like a funny guy, and his lack of much deeper behind that, or really a relationship with other Darkstalkers characters, makes him unfortunately one of the more forgettable characters from the series. I do still absolutely love him though, so I'd say an A tier is deserved enough. This character is not a fighting game character, he just isn't. You fight in Punch-Out, but it obviously isn't a fighting game. I mean, wrestling games are stretching the concept already. I do have one later, kind of, technically. But anyways, Bear Hugger fits the tropes of a Canadian fighting game character so well, and I just want to talk about him. He's like a lumberjack / hillbilly type, and is known for his signature catchphrase, "I like raw fish." The thing that's interesting about him though, is that he's from Saskatoon. How is a lumberjack gonna be in Saskatoon? There's like 2 trees there. Plus it's like a relatively decently sized city, compared to other Canadian cities of course, and so it wouldn't really be considered rural. You know, I'm starting to think Nintendo doesn't really know about every single Canadian city. Eventually, when Next Level Games, who are actually based in Vancouver, developed Punch-Out, it was changed to Salmon Arm, British Columbia, and that works better for when you can actually fish there, but I still think it being in Saskatoon is funnier. I do appreciate the change though, and even though Bear Hugger feels like he's supposed to be from the Ozarks instead of Canada, he's still at least more funny than most stereotypes since he's so ridiculous with it. And hey, the actual Canadian endorsement gives him bonus points in my opinion. Which, by the way, you have to be Canadian to disagree with my opinion. B tier. Let's make something clear. King Lion is not the final boss of Savage Rain and Kizuna Encounter. That is King Leo, and he is American. This is his imposter, King Lion, that has basically his exact moveset and is a completely different character. He's also Canadian. You might think I would be a bit miffed by the fact that a Canadian character's entire thing is being a cheap imitation of an American, but no, I am not, because that's true and funny. 90% of Canadian culture is desperately trying not to be like America, and the idea of a dev team across the entire world saying is funny to me. I like King Lion though. He's a boxer who uses a massive sword for some reason, and with a game that's as combo heavy as Savage Rain, he's surprisingly easy to use. I really like his design too, although I can't really attribute that to this guy instead of King Leo. It's a complicated situation. I'm leaning A tier, but we already have 2 there, and it feels like a cop-out at this point, so I'll give him B tier. Him not being that original makes him a bit lower, although I do like the fact that he's not original, so I'm gonna stop thinking about this now. Saber, and yes, his name is Rip Saber, is a character from the criminally underrated Ring of Destruction Slam Masters 2. That's a fighting game about wrestlers, and his gimmick is that he's a soldier, fighting with a shovel and grenades and stuff, which is such a 90s wrestling thing. He's actually meant to be a parody of over-the-top gimmicks and hardcore wrestling of the 80s and 90s, but he's still pretty cool. Maybe it's the fact that he's designed by Tetsuo Hara, the creator of Fist the North Star, that makes his fighting style not really feel that weird in context. That said, despite how silly he is, Saber actually shows a lot of knowledge about Canada. For one, he's from Calgary, which has a long history of wrestling and is pretty famous for the sport. He's even possibly inspired by a few wrestlers from Calgary, who are pretty popular in Japan. It might not seem like a big deal, but it shows just a bit more care than the average character in this video, which contributes to the sense of a celebration of wrestling in that series. Honestly, he might be an S tier. He probably has a bigger reason than Maxima to actually be Canadian, and while I'm not a wrestling fan by any means, this is probably the one that shows the most care about Canada at all. And look at him, that design is so cool, so sure, S tier. I also must mention the character Jumbo Flapjack from the original Saturday Night Slam Masters. He's Canadian, but only in the US version. In the Japanese version, he's from Chicago. I guess they would get offended or something cause look at him, so they changed it. They made it Yellowknife too, which is not as random as Salmon Arm, but still random. Anyways, that doesn't count, and if he did count, he'd be pretty damn low. Damian and Rudolph from the game Groove on Fight are the first openly gay couple in a fighting game. There have been queer characters in fighting games before, but this is the first shown couple. Why have you never heard of them before? Well, probably because Groove on Fight is a pretty obscure game, but also because it's between a 17-year-old and a 40-year-old, goddammit. It's Atlas though, I'm not that surprised. Damian is from Vancouver, and there's kind of like no reason for it. He's barely even a playable character, since he's only in the Sega Saturn port. I don't want to rank him low, cause like, he's a victim, but I'm gonna do it anyway. He gets to be the first C tier. The only reason he's not a D tier is because I kind of like his design. Whatever. And finally, the last character I'm going to rank, Rig from Dead or Alive. I saved him for last since Dead or Alive is a big fighting game series which I've never played, so I was kind of excited to do it for this video. He's unfortunately not that memorable though. The dude's an oil rig worker with some mysterious past, or at least I think he's not that memorable. I'm not very well versed in Dead or Alive lore. I do really like his moveset though. He's a taekwondo fighter, and those are great in fighting games, and Dead or Alive is a very combo based game, so you can pretty much button mash with him with one hand while using your other hand to firmly grip some low hanging fruit. So, not a very memorable character, but a really memorable moveset, average out to a B tier. So here it is, my tier list for Canadian fighting game characters. There's only a handful of characters from Canada, especially compared to Americans, British, Chinese, or Japanese, but I still find the choices for what characters are from Canada interesting. Most of the time it's just, they wanted a character to be slightly differentiated from characters from America, so they make them Canadian. Or just randomly pick Canada, which I'm not opposed to, but other times it shows how people think of Canada as a country. And that's just always neat to see from a Canadian perspective. I know this video might not have been a super nuanced look at Canadian culture, but if you're not Canadian, I hope it's at least an interesting insight into some ways people think. I know this video wasn't a super nuanced look at Canadian culture, but if you're not Canadian, I hope it's at least an interesting insight. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later.